was already a question right over there. Yeah.
Hi. Very interesting, although all the time throughout the presentation I found myself thinking, why? In the sense that, here's a completely obscure computer that hardly anybody has ever heard about, and a completely obscure game that hardly anybody has heard about. So I'm just wondering, is this part of a bigger research project where you're looking at various other computers and various other old games, or is this a completely unique kind of, let's have a look at this, let's see how far curiosity can take us?
We plan to eventually analyze all the things. I'm exaggerating, but one thing that I've had to come to terms with as I've analyzed a wide variety of games over the last several years is that not all of them are the most famous or the most popular or the most influential. But the problem is, in terms of looking at interesting implementation, the interesting stuff doesn't necessarily always happen in those games. And so you have to cast your net fairly widely, because sometimes if you find an example of a particular implementation technique, that will be the only place you see it. And so it's not always valuable to look for the big name games, because there are some real gems, going back to the Bogos quote from earlier. There are some real gems, and you just have to look for them.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Well done.
I was actually, but that's like a follow-up question on the. You showed some of the epitextual material, right? So there have been a lot of efforts to curate, to keep, to store, to archive hardware and software, especially most of them well-known stuff, but also lesser-known machines and lesser-known games. But the fact that you actually mentioned the epitextual material, like old ads, computer magazines from that period, is that in your line of work? Is that difficult to find, readily available? Should that be archived as well? How does that fit into the question of what should we be looking at in terms of historical material?
Save everything.
Yeah.
I mean, my primary interest is a technical one, and so usually what happens is that we'll do analyses, but then it is enriched by looking at some of the epitextual material. When we can locate authors or other people, I have sort of this ongoing ethics application, so I can interview them if I can find them. Call me. And one of the problems, though, particularly with interviews, is from a technical point of view, is that people's memory of technical details fades quite quickly. I can't tell you what my code a week ago was doing, to be honest, much less 30 years ago. And so while we can gather anecdotes of development and things we might not otherwise have gleaned as far as using that as, say, a guide to the code, that's of limited value, I think. The other reason I use the term epitext is because I suffered through reading Jeanette's book, and I want to maximize my use of it.
Yep, I'm gonna try this. Getting better.
Yeah. Okay. Yesterday, somebody has a very, very smart question. What is the difference between game and simulation? And now we have a group of people. One of them telling us about a simulation. The others talked about a game. And Juan, you talked about a simulation, but you use words like gameplay and experiences, all this stuff. So I think you are the middle of them. So I need answers.
Technically speaking, all games are discrete time simulations. And with that, I'm passing the mic along.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Every game is trying to simulate something. There is a nice definition that they are simulating not just a physical reality, but also an emotional reality. So that's why I'm so interested in trying to see, well, how you play this and how you involve people personally. But yeah, there are differences between simulations and games, and I think that one of the most obvious differences is the level of gameplay. Now, gameplay in a game goes beyond just the relationship with the data that you have in the game. It's a relationship that actually you construct with your personal experience and everything. Bogost emphasizes like that is subjective. So he called that the simulation gap, basically, that when you are trying to relate with a medium like a simulation, actually you are not understanding how it works, probably. It's more like a subjective understanding of it. And that subjective understanding, I think that it can be used in games, basically. So instead of fighting it, we need to use it. We need to go with the flow. That's my
So there is clearly sort of a differentiation here between sort of the humanity's understanding of what a simulation is and the actual technical, because I would also agree that all games are to an extent simulations, because you're modeling something, so you're simulating something, but yeah, there's like when you call something a simulation in game studies, that's different because it kind of feels like an insult to the game there. I don't know where I was going with this. I just wanted to point out the differentiation that when they say simulation, that maybe I would say something like think something different, precisely because to me a simulation is actively trying to not be a game. Yeah, while a game is not necessarily not actively trying to not be a simulation.
Okay. Maybe to add to this, from a humanities-based perspective, I think most or many scholars would reference Baudrillard's work on simulation, on simulacra, and that actually means that a simulation is specifically a sort of self-referencing system, and it's very difficult to think of a simulation actually relating to an objective or a physical reality, right? So it's sort of post-structuralist thinking about what a simulation is. It's only referencing to itself continuously, just as our sort of linguistic system does. So I guess, I don't know, this doesn't really help any. No. Yeah.
It's always good when the computer scientist in the house gives the most clear answer so far.
I am with them. Too much confusion there. No, I would say that the differentiation is more like a cumulative differentiation. Every game is a simulation. The only difference between the simulation, for example, if you simulate the climate, for example, there is a quite typical simulation. You don't need a player. You don't need any human input there. You just need the variables, the data, which is external for the simulation. So it's not only self-referenced. The one that they show also has data behind it. But the human interactive part is I believe the player is the big difference. The fact that you can interact with it and the simulation doesn't. But actually the simulation is behind the game. So any kind of game, I believe it's simulating some kind, at least physics, which is the very typical simulation. But,
Okay, I'll say this.
Just to add to it, it happens sometimes that you build a game and you try to follow a simulation and actually it doesn't work. We're trying to simulate a simulation too strictly. It doesn't work like a game. I think there's a very good example of some guys, I can remember the name, who made the most authentic driving experience. And it was so good that nobody could drive it.
Yeah.
You need a professional driver for that. So it needs to have simplification to extend actually people can play it.
Just building on something you've just mentioned, and I suppose mainly for the first three papers, this is the idea, well, the role of objectives, of victory conditions within games for education, for research. So is there any way that you could develop your ideas of objectives, what you're doing to maybe, I don't know, maybe to help the kids engage more with the family of the Anglo-Saxon hunter? So maybe the victory condition becomes keep the kids alive. I'm interested as well with the catastrophe research. How I think I understood it was the goal is to recreate the catastrophe.
Tragically, yes. Could be different, but we discussed a lot about it in the beginning, but the problem was that if you create a game that aims to change history, you're like, where in what direction? No, because of course, like the kids, some people, some players could just try to do bad things and see the outcome, but behind it, the aim was to say, well, there was one kind of reality that happens, which is not necessarily bad, because people actually not. The catastrophe is not they all dying, but they just migrated to another place, no? But and they resist in some places. So the idea was to not create some kind of alternative history, but trying to get people engaging in what could be happening. So.
Any further answers or questions?
Yeah, this is less of a question and more of an addition to the response about the difference between games and simulation. There's a very fascinating story that I think everybody dealing with simulations and environments in particular should know. And it concerns one of the most developed attempts to simulate an environment with a complete ecosystem where in a game you would have animals that hunt other animals, and if there are too few deer, then the grass grows and the trees grow and so on. And then if you kill all the deer, then the dragons come out of the forest and start hunting maidens and all this kind of thing. That's literally the case. And it shows how sometimes you have to simplify things, not just because they're more understandable for players, but also because the players destroy them. So the game I'm talking about here is Ultima Online, back in 1997. And that's exactly what they did in the early beta. They had this really sophisticated ecosystem. You had rabbits, bears, deer, whatever. And yes, literally, if you kill too many deer, the dragons start hunting people. And they had to remove it during the beta tests because the players overwhelmed the system. All the players went, and quite naturally went after the herbivores as the easiest things to get loot from. And very soon, the world was amok with wolves and other things, and it just didn't work. So yeah, that's one of the things you have to take into consideration with simulation in games. I think that's probably why even today with games like Skyrim or Far Cry Primal, where you have these sophisticated appearing environments where you have the illusion of a food chain, you don't actually have any food chains, and the animals just randomly spawn outside of your vision.
All right, lest we simulate some cannibalism here, I suggest we move to lunch. Lunch will be downstairs where we were yesterday. You can go outside even if you like. We have Jesse's leave to go outside. That's always great. And we'll be back here at 2. Thank you so.